Imagine waking up to the blinding Egyptian sun, already blazing over the horizon before you've even risen from your bed, made of woven reeds. The air is thick and dry, the kind that steals moisture from your lips and leaves dust in your throat before you've spoken your first word. This isn't a vacation to the pyramids or a tour of ancient wonders. This is your life in ancient Egypt, a world of blistering heat, hard labor, and endless struggle just to survive another sunrise. Most people today imagine ancient Egypt as a land of golden splendor, grand temples, and elegant queens gliding through palaces. But for the majority of people who lived there, life was far from royal. It was harsh, unforgiving, and brutally physical. The farmers bent under the burning sun, the builders carved stone until their hands bled, and even the priests faced crushing pressure to please gods who demanded constant devotion. Every breath of life was a fight against the desert's hunger, the Nile's temper, and the expectations of a society that revolved around gods, kings, and death. In this story, we'll travel back through time and explore what it would really be like to live in ancient Egypt. Not as a pharaoh or a noble, but as an ordinary person, the ones who built the temples, toiled the fields, and carried civilization on their weary shoulders. You'll see the beauty of their world, but also its brutality, discomfort, and endless challenges. From the heat that never fades to the diseases that stalked every household, you'll soon realize why you truly wouldn't last a day in ancient Egypt. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to History for Sleep, your place to drift off to stories from the past. Comment below to tell us what parts of history you'd love to hear next, and when you like to listen. Are you a night owl? A late dreamer? I'd love to know. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let's close our eyes and step into the sands of ancient Egypt, where the past is alive and survival is never guaranteed. The first thing you'd notice in ancient Egypt is the sun. It dominates the sky and rules your life. Even before the morning light has fully spread, the air already feels warm, and by midday, it becomes a searing wave pressing down on your skin. There is no escape from it. The Nile may offer moments of relief, but the air above the desert hums with heat. Every surface, the sand, the stone, even your home's mud brick walls, absorbs the day's fire and releases it slowly through the night, never allowing true coolness. You'd find yourself sweating constantly, wiping dust and grit from your arms, feeling it cling to the moisture on your skin. The Egyptians lived their lives wrapped in this constant furnace, accepting it as part of existence. Shade was a treasure, a thin line between comfort and agony. Many houses had small, narrow openings instead of large windows, not for lack of architectural skill, but to keep the sun's fury outside. Even so, the interiors of homes were stifling, filled with dry, still air. You'd sit close to a fan woven from palm leaves, or use your hands to push the air across your face. At night, you might try to sleep on the roof, chasing the faint whisper of a breeze as you stared at the brilliant canopy of stars. But even then, warmth clung to your skin, and sleep came only in fragments. The desert around you would feel endless. The sand shifted and shimmered under the light, as though the entire world were a sea of gold that burned instead of cooled. The Egyptians were masters of endurance. They learned when to work, when to rest, when to hide from the sun's peak. They wore light linen clothing, soaked in sweat and dust, and even that thin layer felt heavy under the relentless glow. If you came from a modern world of air conditioning and running water, you'd quickly realize how fragile your comfort truly is. In ancient Egypt, luxury meant shade, and survival meant endurance. Farmers began their days early, long before dawn, working while the air was still bearable. As the sun climbed, their pace slowed, not from laziness, but from necessity. To labor in the heat was to challenge nature itself. The body weakened quickly, and water was precious. A single day under that burning sky could drain you of all strength. Even the animals, the oxen and donkeys, sought shelter when they could. The people of Egypt had adapted to this rhythm, their lives set by the sun's temper, rise with it, rest at its height, and work again as it lowered. Yet there was also beauty in it. The light painted everything in gold and amber, turning the world into a dream of fire and stone. The people believed the sun itself was a god, Ra, the great creator, sailing across the sky each day. They did not curse its power, even as it punished them. They respected it, feared it, and relied on it to give life to the land. The Nile's floodwaters, the growth of crops, and even the turning of time were all bound to the rhythm of the sun. To live in ancient Egypt was to live in obedience to that blinding eye above, both its servant and its child. But for someone from another time, the adjustment would be unbearable. The heat would sap your will, the dryness would crack your skin, and the brightness would blind you. You'd long for clouds, for rain, for the cool dampness of shade that never truly comes. The Egyptians did not complain. They adapted. They found beauty in the unbearable. Their bodies were hardened by it, their minds trained to accept the sun's rule. You, though, would last only hours before exhaustion overtook you. And as night fell, you'd find no comfort in the dark, only the lingering heat and the quiet hum of the desert waiting for another day to begin. In the vast world of ancient Egypt, water was life. Every drop mattered, and every cup had value beyond gold. The Nile River, the heart of the land, was the only reason civilization existed there at all. Without it, Egypt would have been nothing but desert, a lifeless expanse of burning sand and endless sky. The river's flood gave the people crops, food, and the strength to survive. But it was not always generous. It followed its own rhythm, rising and falling as it pleased, sometimes too much, sometimes too little. The people who lived by its banks depended entirely on its mercy. If you found yourself there, under that same blazing sun, you'd learn very quickly that thirst was not just discomfort, it was danger. The average Egyptian could not afford to waste water. It was fetched daily from the Nile, carried in jars balanced on shoulders or heads, often from long distances. The water was brown, warm, and sometimes filled with silt and insects, but it was all they had. There were no filters, no clean wells, and no icy refreshment. If you were lucky, the sediment would settle at the bottom of your pot before you drank. Most of the time, you drank it as it was, because waiting meant going thirsty. Your throat would ache from the dryness, your lips would crack, and every sip would feel like a small act of survival. Bathing was a luxury few could enjoy daily. The wealthy might have small basins for washing, perfumed oils to cleanse the skin, and servants to pour cool water over their shoulders. But for ordinary people, a wash meant a quick splash from the river or a simple rinse from a jar. Sweat, dust, and the stickiness of labor clung to the body, becoming a constant companion. You might find yourself dreaming of a cold shower, of the simple joy of turning a tap and feeling clear, clean water, but that was a dream far beyond reach. In Egypt, you learned to use little and make it last. For farmers, water meant more than drinking. Their crops depended on the annual flood. The river would swell with melted snow from distant lands, spreading rich black silt over the fields. It was a gift that brought grain, vegetables, and fruit to life. But when the floods failed, hunger followed. If the Nile rose too high, it destroyed homes and fields. If it stayed too low, crops withered under the sun. Each year was a gamble, and the people prayed to Hapi, the god of the flood, for balance. You'd feel the tension in every village as they watched the river's edge, waiting to see if it would rise enough to save them or too much to destroy them. When water was scarce, tempers flared. Villages argued over canals, and families guarded their supplies carefully. Wells were rare treasures, dug deep and maintained with care. To steal water was one of the worst offenses. a sin against your neighbors and the gods. Yet even in such scarcity, the Egyptians remained devoted to their rituals. They offered water to the dead, believing it would refresh their spirits in the afterlife. Even in death, thirst was feared. To die without water was to risk eternal dryness, a fate worse than decay. The heat only made things worse. As you worked under the sun, your body would beg for relief. Sweat poured from your skin, but there was no breeze to cool it. You'd feel lightheaded, dizzy, your mouth a desert of its own. Even a single mouthful of water could revive you, bring life back to your limbs. The Egyptians learned to ration, to sip slowly, to endure. Their strength came from patience and understanding the rhythms of nature. But you, unaccustomed to such deprivation, would crumble quickly. Dehydration would steal your energy, cloud your mind, and leave you weak long before the day was over. And yet, for all the hardship, the Nile was a wonder. At dawn, it glimmered like liquid gold under the rising sun. Fishermen cast their nets, children played at its edge, and the smell of life filled the air. The river was both harsh and kind, taking as much as it gave. To live in ancient Egypt was to live in a delicate balance with the Nile respecting it, fearing it, and thanking it for every drop it provided. You would soon understand why they called it a gift from the gods, and why, without it, no one could survive a single day. If you were to survive even a single day in ancient Egypt, it would be because of the Nile. The river was the pulse of the land, the heart that gave life to everything around it. Without the Nile, Egypt would have been nothing but endless sand and silence. Every part of existence revolved around its waters, from the way people built their homes to how they measured time itself. The rhythm of life was set by its rise and fall. When the river flooded, people celebrated. When it shrank, they prayed in fear. The Nile was not simply a river. It was life, death, and everything in between. You'd wake before sunrise and hear the quiet sounds of the river stirring. The soft slap of water against a boat, the call of birds rising from the reeds, and the murmured voices of fishermen pushing off to cast their nets. The air near the Nile was cooler, filled with the scent of wet earth and papyrus. For a brief moment, it felt peaceful, almost gentle. Families would gather at the riverbanks to fetch water or wash clothes, while children splashed in the shallows, laughing in the morning light. The Nile was the village's meeting place, the source of its rhythm and its joy. But the river was also unpredictable. Each year, the people watched for the flood, waiting to see if the waters would rise high enough to cover the fields. Too low, and crops would fail. Too high, and entire villages could be swept away. The Egyptians learned to read the signs, the color of the water, the behavior of the animals, the level marks on the nilometers carved into stone. These ancient measuring tools told them if abundance or disaster was on the way. It was a delicate balance that ruled every life. To modern eyes, it might seem fragile, but to them, it was order, the sacred rhythm of creation. You'd see men guiding cattle to plow the rich black soil left behind by the floods, the earth so fertile it seemed to breathe life itself. Women would gather reeds and clay to make baskets and jars, working side by side under the watch of the sun. Fishermen pulled in their catches tilapia, catfish, and perch, enough to feed their families and trade for goods. Boats carved from papyrus glided gracefully across the water, their sails like wings catching the wind. Along the banks, palm trees swayed gently, offering a rare shade from the heat. This was Egypt's gift, its heartbeat, its hope. But for all its beauty, life along the Nile was not easy. The river brought both blessing and burden. With the floods came snakes, crocodiles, and swarms of insects that made daily work dangerous. Crocodiles lurked near the edges, hidden beneath the murky surface, striking without warning. Fishermen risked their lives every time they cast a net, and mothers kept children close, fearful of the river's dark moods. The Nile gave life, but it could also take it without hesitation. Still, the people's faith in it was unshakable. They saw the Nile as a divine being, a gift from the gods. Each year's flood was a sacred act, a renewal of the world. Priests offered prayers and songs to Hapi, the god of the Nile, thanking him for his generosity. They threw offerings into the water flowers, bread, and sometimes small figures carved from clay. It was a spiritual connection, one that wove nature, religion, and survival into a single story. At night, the river changed. The surface reflected the stars like a mirror, the sounds of insects filling the air. Families gathered near its banks to cool their feet after long days of labor, telling stories passed down through generations. You could almost forget how harsh the desert was, how difficult life could be, when you sat beside the Nile under the quiet light of the moon. The people of Egypt learned to live in harmony with this ancient river, accepting its moods, respecting its power, and trusting it with their very existence. For you, it might feel like walking a tightrope between beauty and danger, comfort and struggle. But for them, it was simply life, the only life they knew, flowing endlessly, as eternal as the stars above. In ancient Egypt, life was labor. Every sunrise was a signal to work, and every sunset marked the end of exhaustion. Whether you were a farmer, a builder, or a servant, your body was your greatest tool, and the work it performed decided your fate. Most people toiled from childhood until their final breath, their hands roughened and backs bent under years of strain. The grandeur of Egypt's temples and tombs might fill you with awe today, but behind every stone and carving were thousands of aching bodies, sweating under the unrelenting sun. The beauty of Egypt was built from the suffering of its people. If you woke up as a farmer in ancient Egypt, your day began before dawn. The air would still be cool, but the heat waited just beyond the horizon. You'd rise from your mat, grab your simple tools, and head to the fields by the river. The soil, dark and rich from the Nile's floods, was precious and had to be worked with care. There were no machines to plow or sow, only human hands and animal strength. You'd dig trenches for irrigation, scatter seeds, and drive cattle through the mud to press them into the earth. The work was endless and demanding. Insects swarmed around you, biting through sweat-soaked linen. The sun soon rose high, and its heat pressed down until breathing felt like labor too. Payment was rarely in coin. Most workers were compensated with rations: bread, beer, onions, and sometimes fish. Beer was not a luxury. It was a necessity. It replaced water during long hours of labor, nourishing the body with calories and helping mask the taste of stale food. Each sip was thick and cloudy, nothing like the clear drink you might imagine. For a farmer or worker, it was fuel, a lifeline that kept them moving through another punishing day. Beyond the fields, laborers worked on vast construction projects that defined Egypt's glory. Temples, tombs, and monuments rose from the desert like mountains of stone, each block weighing tons. Men hauled these stones with ropes and wooden sleds, dragging them across sand, wetted to reduce friction. Supervisors watched closely, shouting orders and carrying rods to ensure discipline. You'd feel the strain in your arms, your legs trembling under the effort. The desert echoed with the sound of hammers striking stone, chisels shaping hieroglyphs, and voices chanting work songs to keep rhythm and morale. Life as a builder was perilous. Injuries were common, and the tools were crude. There were no safety measures, no rest breaks beyond a few gulps of warm water or beer. Dust filled your lungs, the sun scorched your skin, and exhaustion was constant. Yet for all the hardship, there was pride. To work on a temple or a pyramid was to serve eternity. You were building something meant to last forever, a connection between humans and gods. Many workers believed that the gods watched them as they labored, and that their suffering had divine meaning. Even artisans and craftsmen, who seemed to live better lives, were bound by the same relentless rhythm. In workshops filled with smoke and noise, They carved statues, painted walls, and created intricate jewelry. Their hands were skilled, but their lives were still controlled by those above them. Every mistake could bring punishment. Every masterpiece belonged not to them, but to their masters or the temple. Still, their artistry gave Egypt its eternal voice. The colors, the carvings, the stories that have survived thousands of years. Women worked too, though their labor often went unnoticed. They baked bread, brewed beer, spun linen, and cared for children. Their days were long and repetitive, their contributions essential, but rarely celebrated. The hum of daily work filled every household, every street. To live in ancient Egypt was to exist within a rhythm of effort, need, and endurance. For you, accustomed to rest, comfort, and choice, such a life would be unbearable. The endless repetition, the blistering heat, the lack of rest, these were constants that broke the body and hardened the spirit. Yet the Egyptians accepted it all as part of their destiny. To work was to live, and to live was to serve, whether the gods, the pharaoh, or simply the hunger in your own stomach. You might not last a day in their world, but they built one that lasted millennia. And every grain of that endurance was shaped by the labor of those whose names history has forgotten. If you had been born a farmer in ancient Egypt, your life would be bound to the soil. The rhythm of your existence was not your own, it was the Nile's. Each year, the river's flood determined your fate. Too little water meant famine. Too much meant ruin. You lived by its mercy, planting and harvesting according to its moods. Your back bent with labor, your hands blistered and cracked, and your skin darkened under the eternal sun. The work was endless, but it was also sacred, for through your effort, life continued. Every loaf of bread, every jar of beer, every offering to the gods began with the toil of your hands. The farming year was divided into seasons that revolved around the Nile's flood. When the waters rose and covered the fields, you waited. Boats replaced paths, and your home became an island amid a vast lake of muddy water. It was both a time of rest and anxiety. You prayed that the flood would be just right. If it lingered too long, the planting would be delayed. If it receded too quickly, the soil would dry and crack before the seeds could take root. The priests and scribes measured the river carefully, marking its height on the Nilometer, predicting what kind of harvest the year would bring. For you, those measurements decided whether your family would eat or starve. When the water finally retreated, you worked without pause. The land, black and rich with silt, was ready, and you had to seize the moment before it hardened. With simple wooden plows pulled by oxen, you broke the earth. You sowed barley, wheat, and flax, casting the seeds by hand. The air filled with the scent of damp soil and sweat, and insects buzzed around your legs. There was no glory in this labor, only necessity. Your livelihood depended on your strength, and there was no room for weakness. Every member of the family helped the men plowing, the women sowing, the children driving away birds that tried to eat the seeds. As the plants grew, so did the dangers. Locusts could destroy weeks of work in a single night. The heat could wither the crop before it ripened. Water had to be diverted from canals into the fields, and that meant digging ditches under the sun. The irrigation system, though ingenious, demanded constant attention. One broken channel could mean disaster for a season's worth of food. You'd spend hours knee-deep in mud, guiding the water through narrow paths, your muscles aching from effort. Even when your work was done, you could not rest. The Nile and the weather never slept, and neither could you. When harvest came, it brought both relief and more work. You'd cut the stalks with sickles made of wood and flint, gathering them into bundles. The air filled with dust, chaff, and the shouts of workers. Grain was threshed by hand, then winnowed in the wind to separate it from the husk. What remained would be measured and divided, part kept for your family, part paid as tax to the temples and officials. The priests claimed it was an offering to the gods, but you knew that what left your hands often never returned. The kingdom was built on your back, and you carried it silently. Your food came from your own fields, but it was simple and repetitive. Bread made from barley or emmer wheat, beer, onions, garlic, and sometimes fish from the river. Meat was a rarity, reserved for festivals or sacrifices. Still, you were grateful for what you had, because hunger was always close. There were years when the Nile failed, when no crops grew, and famine spread across the land. People ate whatever they could find, roots, insects, even clay mixed with flour to trick the stomach. You'd see desperation in every village, mothers weeping over empty pots, fathers trading tools for a handful of grain. And yet, through it all, you endured. Farmers were the foundation of Egypt, the unseen lifeblood of its greatness. The temples, the pyramids, the banquets of the rich, all of it was made possible by your toil. But no one carved your name in stone. Your life passed quietly, your work forgotten by those who benefited from it. You would rise each morning before the sun and work until your shadow disappeared beneath your feet. And still, at the end of the day, you'd look at the dark, fertile earth and feel a quiet pride. For all its hardship, your labor sustained life, fed the gods, and kept the Nile's promise alive. Without you, Egypt would crumble, and yet your only reward was survival. That, and the knowledge that you'd be giving everything you had to the land that gave you nothing in return. If the farmers gave Egypt life, the craftsmen and builders gave it form. Every temple, every statue, every grand monument that has survived the centuries was shaped by their hands. They were the quiet artists behind Egypt's immortality, yet their lives were filled with hardship, repetition, and exhaustion. The glory of the pyramids, the beauty of the tombs, and the majesty of the temples all came at the cost of calloused palms, strained backs, and years of labor under the punishing desert sun. To be a builder or craftsman in ancient Egypt was to dedicate your life to something greater than yourself, even if it meant losing everything in the process. You might imagine builders as slaves, forced to toil endlessly under the whips of overseers. While some were indeed laborers bound by debt or status, many were skilled workers, organized into teams who took pride in their craft. In places like Deir el-Medina, a village built specifically for tomb builders, artisans and masons lived close to the Valley of the Kings. Their work was dangerous but honored, for they were creating the eternal resting places of pharaohs. They carved, painted, and constructed with precision, believing that every detail mattered in the journey to the afterlife. The gods, they thought, could see every stroke of the chisel, every line of paint. Your day would begin early, the cool of dawn the only mercy before the heat arrived. You'd gather your tools, chisels, hammers, copper saws, and wooden mallets, and walk to the site. The sound of striking stone would fill the air, rhythmic and steady, echoing through the valley. Dust would cling to your skin and fill your lungs, making it hard to breathe. You'd wipe sweat from your face with linen already stiff with salt. Around you, hundreds of others worked in unison, cutting, hauling, shaping, painting. The overseers moved among the workers, ensuring no one slowed. They carried sticks not always for punishment, but as reminders that the pharaoh's deadlines waited for no one. The work itself was grueling. The limestone and sandstone were heavy, and every block had to be moved by human strength. Ramps of mud brick and wood were built to haul the stones upward, a process that required endless effort and coordination. The workers sang chants to keep rhythm, voices rising above the desert silence as they pulled ropes in unison. Even a single misstep could mean crushed limbs or death. Injuries were common, but rest was rare. The sick were treated with herbs and prayers, then sent back to work as soon as they could stand. Inside the tombs, artists labored in cramped chambers lit by flickering oil lamps. The heat and fumes were suffocating. They painted intricate scenes on walls, depictions of gods, afterlife journeys, and offerings. The colors came from minerals they ground by hand, red from ochre, blue from azurite, green from malachite. Every detail had purpose, every symbol a sacred meaning. They worked in silence, the scratch of brushes and the tapping of chisels their constant companions. Some believed that through their art, they ensured the pharaoh's soul would live forever. It was devotion, discipline, and survival all at once. Yet despite their skill, craftsmen were not free from hardship. Their wages came in rations of grain, oil, and beer. When supplies ran short, as they often did, workers went hungry. There were even times when entire teams went on strike, the earliest recorded in history, protesting delayed rations from the state. For a brief moment, they found their voice, demanding fairness in a world that rarely offered it. But such moments were fleeting. The work always resumed, for Egypt's monuments would not build themselves. At night, you'd return home covered in dust, your body aching, your hands trembling from the day's labor. The desert cooled, but the pain lingered. You might sit outside your small house, sharing a loaf of bread and a mug of beer with your family, staring toward the half-built structure that consumed your life. It was both your prison and your pride. You knew you would never see its completion, but perhaps your children would, and their children after them. That was enough. For you, coming from a world of machines and comfort, this life would break you within days. The noise, the heat, the monotony, it would crush both body and spirit. Yet the Egyptians endured it for generations, driven by duty, faith, and the belief that their labor was divine. Every mark they left in stone was a whisper to eternity. And though their names are long forgotten, their work remains. The monuments of Egypt still rise from the desert, silent witnesses to the strength, skill, and suffering of those who built them, one stone at a time. In the world of ancient Egypt, sickness was as much a mystery as it was a threat. The people lived surrounded by heat, insects, and disease, yet their understanding of the human body was shaped by faith and superstition as much as by knowledge. Medicine existed, and some of it was remarkably advanced for its time, but it was also deeply entwined with religion and magic. The Egyptians believed that health was a balance between the physical and the spiritual. To fall ill was not just a matter of the body failing, it was a sign that something in your soul, or the favor of the gods, had gone wrong. To live in their world meant walking a fine line between life and death every single day. You might imagine that living beside the Nile meant access to clean water and fertile land, but those same waters carried disease. Mosquitoes bred in the marshes, spreading fevers and chills. Parasites lurked in the river, slipping into the body through bare skin. Food spoiled quickly in the heat, and without refrigeration, stomach illnesses were constant companions. Cuts and scrapes from daily labor easily became infected, their redness spreading up the arm or leg, bringing fever and agony. A simple wound, one that today might be cleaned and forgotten, could turn deadly in days. In ancient Egypt, survival depended not just on strength, but on luck and the mercy of unseen forces. When you became ill, your first stop was likely not a doctor, but a priest. Healing was considered a divine act, and many temples were dedicated to gods of medicine, like Imhotep, the deified physician, or Sekhmet, the fierce lion-headed goddess whose wrath was believed to cause plagues. Priests would recite spells, burn incense, and offer amulets to drive away evil spirits thought to cause sickness. The line between medicine and magic was blurred. Sometimes the only treatment was a prayer whispered into the dark. Yet the Egyptians were not without practical skill. They practiced surgery, dentistry, and herbal medicine with surprising sophistication. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, an ancient medical text, describes treatments for broken bones, wounds, and head injuries that show real understanding of anatomy. Doctors used honey to clean wounds. It acted as an antiseptic and linen bandages to cover them. They set broken bones with splints, stitched cuts with thread, and even performed crude forms of brain surgery. For their time, they were remarkable healers, though they mixed genuine remedies with rituals and charms in equal measure. Herbal medicine was everywhere. Garlic and onions were eaten to boost strength and ward off illness. Willow bark, which contained the same pain-relieving ingredient as modern aspirin, was brewed into teas for pain. Aloe was used for burns, castor oil for constipation, and dates for energy. Many treatments worked by accident, discovered through centuries of trial and error. But others were far more dangerous. Some prescriptions called for animal dung, moldy bread, or crushed insects to be applied to wounds. The belief was that the gods infused all things with power, even the unpleasant ones. In a world without germ theory, the cure could easily make things worse. Dentistry was another ordeal entirely. Egyptians loved sweet dates, honey, and beer filled their diet, but their bread contained grit and sand from stone grinding, wearing down their teeth. Abscesses, infections, and decay were constant. The pain must have been unbearable, and though some early dental treatments existed, they were crude. Holes were drilled to release pressure, herbs were packed into cavities, and teeth were sometimes pulled with bronze tools. There was no anesthesia, no comfort, only endurance. For you, used to hospitals, antibiotics, and sterile instruments, a single visit to an Egyptian healer would feel like a nightmare. The smell of herbs in decay would fill the air, and the chants of priests would echo off temple walls as incense curled upward. You'd watch as treatments were applied with unwashed hands, as spells were murmured over your body, as oils and powders were rubbed into your wounds. You'd feel fear, because here recovery was never certain. And yet, in their own way, the Egyptians understood something essential. They saw health as more than just the body. It was balance, harmony with nature and the gods. They believed that to heal, one must restore that harmony. Their methods, though strange and sometimes deadly, came from a desire to understand the world and survive within it. And in that struggle, they laid the foundation for centuries of medicine to come. But for an outsider, even a minor illness in ancient Egypt could mean the end. Between the heat, the disease, and the limited remedies, your chances of lasting a day were as fragile as the papyrus their medical wisdom was written on. If you think you could survive a day in ancient Egypt, you might want to imagine what it would feel like to wake up covered in sweat, dust, and insects before the sun even reached its height. The beauty of the Nile and the golden sands hid a darker reality, one of disease, filth, and constant discomfort. Cleanliness was important to the Egyptians, but the world they lived in made true sanitation impossible. Every part of life, from where they slept to what they ate, exposed them to illness. The heat, the insects, and the water that gave them life also carried sickness that stalked their bodies from birth to death. The homes of most Egyptians were simple mud brick structures, small, hot, and crowded. Families slept on reed mats or low platforms, their bodies sticking to the surface in the thick, humid air. Windows were tiny to keep out the heat, which also meant that air circulation was almost non-existent. At night, insects crept across the floor and walls, drawn by the warmth of bodies and the smell of food. Mosquitoes buzzed endlessly, biting through thin linen, spreading fevers and disease. You could swat, cover, or fan them away, but they always came back. Fleas and lice were constant companions, burrowing into clothes, bedding, and hair. For an outsider, it would feel unbearable, an endless itch that no washing could cure. The Egyptians bathed often, at least once a day if possible, but it was not enough to escape the filth of their surroundings. The Nile served as their bath, their drinking source, and their sewer all at once. People washed clothes, bathed, and threw waste into the same waters that fed their fields and filled their jars. Crocodiles and hippos lurked near the banks, but they were not the most dangerous things in the river. Invisible parasites swam in the water, entering the body through skin and causing fevers, pain, and sometimes death. Most Egyptians lived with chronic illness, their bodies slowly wearing down under the invisible weight of infection. The streets were not much better. In villages, waste from animals and people mixed with mud and straw, creating a constant stench. Flies swarmed around everything, landing on food, faces, and open wounds. Garbage was thrown into alleyways or pits, where it rotted under the sun. There were no sewage systems, no running water, no separation between clean and dirty. Even in wealthier homes, chamber pots were emptied into the streets or the river. The smell of decay and humanity was everywhere, a scent that would cling to your clothes and your skin, no matter how much you washed. Disease moved easily through such a world. Fevers, stomach illnesses, skin infections, and parasites were common. Children often died before reaching adulthood, their bodies too fragile to fight the constant assaults. The lucky ones survived long enough to build a tolerance, though it came at the cost of lifelong weakness. The Egyptians blamed many illnesses on the will of the gods or the anger of spirits. They believed that cleanliness of the soul could protect the body, so rituals and amulets were as important as herbs and salves. Priests recited spells to banish sickness, and people wore charms shaped like the eye of Horus or scarab beetles to keep evil away. But no magic could stop the diseases that came from their own way of life. Even food carried risk. Without proper storage, bread and grain quickly grew moldy. Meat spoiled almost as soon as it was cooked unless dried or salted. Fish from the Nile could carry worms or parasites, and vegetables were washed in contaminated water. Every meal was a gamble, and your stomach would likely rebel against it within hours. Insects found their way into everything: flies into bread dough, beetles into grain jars, and worms into fruit. The people of Egypt had learned to ignore it. You would not last so easily. The heat made it worse. Open wounds healed slowly in the dust and sweat, often becoming infected. The sun baked the land and the people alike, making every breath feel heavy. The only relief came from the river's edge, but even that comfort was deceptive, carrying sickness beneath its shining surface. You would feel exhaustion creep into your body faster than you thought possible, the constant battle against heat, thirst, and filth draining your strength. And yet, somehow, the Egyptians endured. They adapted to their world in ways that seem impossible. They developed oils and perfumes to mask the smell of sweat and decay. They shaved their heads to fight lice and wore wigs for comfort. They bathed in natron salts, which cleansed and preserved their skin. Their resilience was their greatest medicine, their belief that life was worth every hardship. They built beauty in a land of disease, carved eternity from the dust, and faced the misery of their daily existence with quiet strength. But for someone from another time, even one night in their world buzzing with insects, heavy with heat, and filled with the hum of unseen sickness, would feel like an eternity you wouldn't survive. In ancient Egypt, faith was not a choice, it was the air you breathed. Every sound, every shadow, every turn of the Nile carried meaning. The gods were everywhere, in the sun that burned your skin, the water that fed your crops, the wind that carried sand across the desert. To live in Egypt was to live in the presence of unseen powers who demanded constant devotion and respect. You didn't just believe in the gods, you feared them, honored them, and shaped every moment of your life around their will. For an outsider, it would feel like a weight pressing down on your mind, an invisible presence watching every move, demanding obedience through both hope and fear. From birth, religion defined your identity. The priests taught that the gods had created order out of chaos, and that humans were responsible for keeping that balance. This cosmic order was called Mat, the principle of truth, harmony, and justice. To live outside of Mat was to invite disaster, both in this world and the next. You would feel this in every decision, every ritual, every breath. The pharaoh himself was seen as a living god. the bridge between the divine and the mortal, tasked with maintaining Mat for all of Egypt. His word was law not just because of power, but because disobedience was an offense against the very fabric of existence. Your daily life revolved around rituals and offerings. In the morning, you might sprinkle water on the ground to honor the Nile, or whisper a prayer before eating. You'd pass statues of gods in every town: Ra, the sun god; Isis, the mother; Osiris, the ruler of the dead; Anubis, the guide of souls, and each had its own temple, priests, and ceremonies. Even the simplest act, like planting a seed or lighting a lamp, had spiritual significance. The Egyptians believed that every action could please or anger the gods, so they filled their lives with symbols and rituals to keep the balance. For you, it would be exhausting, a constant performance of devotion without rest. Temples dominated every city, towering structures of stone that echoed with chants and the smell of incense. Only priests could enter their inner chambers, where statues of the gods were bathed, dressed, and fed daily with offerings of bread, beer, and flowers. The ordinary people gathered outside, bowing and praying, their eyes full of awe and fear. The gods were not kind. They were powerful, unpredictable, and often cruel. A bad flood, a poor harvest, or an outbreak of disease could mean that someone had angered them. People offered gifts to appease divine wrath, hoping their prayers would be heard among the thousands of others whispered into the desert wind. Festivals brought brief moments of joy. During these celebrations, statues of the gods were carried through the streets. Music and dancing filled the air, and food was shared among the people. But even these moments carried a sense of reverence and fear. The gods were watching, and celebration was as much about appeasement as pleasure. The line between devotion and desperation was thin. You'd feel it in the way people bowed their heads, afraid to look too long at the divine figures passing by. Religion also shaped death as much as life. The Egyptians believed the afterlife was a mirror of this world, filled with beauty and peace, but only if one had lived rightly. At death, your heart would be weighed against the feather of Mat in the hall of judgment. If your heart was lighter, you would pass into paradise. If it was heavy with sin, it would be devoured by the monstrous Ammit, and your soul would cease to exist. This fear guided every action. People made offerings, confessed wrongdoings, and recited prayers for forgiveness. The idea that death was only another beginning made them both fearless and deeply cautious, trapped between faith and terror. To live in this world of gods was to exist without privacy or peace of mind. You could not escape divine judgment, for it was sown into every part of your world. Even illnesses, droughts, or accidents were seen as signs of divine displeasure. You'd feel it every time the wind changed, every time the sky darkened, every time the Nile failed to rise. The gods ruled the hearts of men as much as the kingdom itself. There was comfort in that belief, but also an unending pressure to remain pure, obedient, and humble. For you, raised in a time of logic and science, this world of invisible power and constant devotion would feel suffocating. Yet for the Egyptians, it was purpose, it was life itself, and without it, the world would fall back into chaos. If you stepped inside the home of an ordinary Egyptian, you might be surprised by its simplicity. These were not grand palaces or ornate villas, but small, sun-baked rectangles of mud brick, built to keep out the heat and dust. The walls were the color of the desert itself, blending into the land as though they had risen naturally from it. Inside, the air was heavy and dry, smelling faintly of smoke, sweat, and baked earth. This was where families lived, ate, slept, and struggled humble shelters that stood against the relentless sun and sand. Life inside one of these homes was close, crowded, and filled with the constant rhythm of survival. Most homes had only a few rooms, often just one main space for living and another for storage or sleeping. The roof was flat and made of wooden beams covered in reeds and mud, sturdy enough to serve as an extra living area. On warm nights, which were nearly every night, families would climb ladders to sleep on the roof beneath the stars, searching for a faint breeze. During the day, this same space was used for drying food, weaving cloth, or simply escaping the stifling air below. The thick mud brick walls kept out the worst of the heat during the day, but trapped it at night, turning the house into an oven long after sunset. There was little furniture. A few reed mats, low stools, and simple clay pots made up most of what you'd find inside. Beds were rare luxuries. Most people slept on woven mats laid across the floor, sometimes with a wooden headrest instead of a pillow. The floors were hard-packed earth, swept daily but always coated with a fine layer of dust from the desert winds. The hearth was the heart of the home, a small clay stove or fire pit used for cooking. The smell of baking bread often filled the air, mixing with the faint tongue of smoke that never quite left the walls. Light came from oil lamps, flickering weakly in the dim interior. The lamps burned animal fat or vegetable oil, and their smoke added to the haze that filled the small space. Windows were small, and set high in the walls, meant more for ventilation than view. Privacy was almost non-existent. Children, parents, and sometimes grandparents all shared the same space. Conversations were hushed, and daily life was built on quiet cooperation. Every sound carried the scrape of a pot, the laughter of children, the distant cries of animals outside. Water was precious and had to be fetched daily from the river. Clay jars lined one corner of the house, filled carefully and guarded against waste. Each drop mattered, especially during the dry months. You'd use a handful for washing, another for cooking, and the rest for drinking. Cleanliness was valued, but it was difficult to maintain. The family bathed together, usually outdoors or near the river, while their clothes simple linen garments were washed and hung to dry on the roof. Even in the midst of hardship, there was a sense of pride in keeping things neat and orderly. Dirt was everywhere, but people fought against it, just as they did the heat and hunger. Meals were simple but comforting. Bread and beer formed the base of every meal, with additions of onions, beans, lentils, or small fish when available. A clay oven baked flat loaves daily, and the rhythm of kneading dough was as familiar as breathing. The family would sit together on the floor, eating with their hands, sharing from a single pot. There was little variety, but food meant life, and even the smallest meal was a reason for quiet gratitude. Sometimes during festivals or after a successful harvest, the family might enjoy a treat: fresh fruit, honey, or roasted duck, but such moments were rare and deeply cherished. Despite the hardships, the home was a place of warmth and connection. The Egyptians filled their spaces with small touches of beauty: painted pottery, woven mats with bright patterns, amulets hanging on the walls to ward off evil. The walls might be decorated with simple drawings or symbols of protection, such as the Eye of Horus or the Ankh. Music, too, found its way into these home-soft songs sung by mothers to their children, or the quiet hum of a reed flute played in the evening light. In such simplicity, there was peace, a rhythm that tied each generation to the next. But for you, accustomed to space, comfort, and cool air, life inside a mud brick home would feel stifling. The air would be heavy, the heat constant, the sounds of insects and neighbors unending. You'd long for a door that closed tightly, for running water, for silence. Yet the Egyptians endured it all with quiet strength. Their homes, though small, were built with love and care, shaped by hands that understood the desert's demands. To them, these spaces were not prisons, they were sanctuaries, fragile walls standing bravely against the endless sand and sun. In ancient Egypt, food was both a gift and a struggle. The land along the Nile was fertile, capable of feeding millions, yet most people lived with little variety in what they ate. The river provided life, but not luxury. For the common Egyptian, meals were simple, repetitive, and often coarse. Still, they sustained a civilization that lasted thousands of years, shaping a diet built on survival, ritual, and the rhythm of the Nile itself. If you were to sit down to a meal in one of their homes, you might quickly realize that comfort was not the goal endurance was. Bread and beer were the foundation of Egyptian life. Every household made them. Every person depended on them. The bread was dense and dark, made from emmer wheat or barley ground on stone slabs. The process filled the air with dust, and bits of sand often ended up in the dough. Over time, this wore down people's teeth, leaving them cracked and painful. The bread was baked in clay ovens, round and rough, with a flavor that was earthy, slightly sour, and filled with grit. To the Egyptians, it was not just food, it was sacred, a symbol of life and stability. Even in tombs, loaves of bread were placed beside the dead to nourish their souls in the afterlife. Beer accompanied nearly every meal, thick and cloudy, more like a liquid bread than the clear drink you might imagine. Made from fermented barley, it was nutritious and provided much of the calories people needed to survive. Workers on construction sites were often paid in beer and bread rather than coin, and records show entire families receiving daily rations measured in jars. The taste would surprise you: sweet, heavy, and warm, flavored with dates or herbs. It quenched thirst, filled the stomach, and softened the harshness of the day. For children and adults alike, beer was a staple as essential as water. Beyond bread and beer, the diet of the common Egyptian was modest. Onions, garlic, and leeks were everyday foods, eaten raw or cooked into stews. Lentils, chickpeas, and beans provided much-needed protein, while fruits like dates, figs, and pomegranates offered natural sweetness when available. Vegetables grew easily in the rich soil. Cucumbers, lettuce, and radishes were common, their freshness a brief relief from the heat. Fish from the Nile was a frequent source of food, grilled, dried, or salted for later use. But meat, especially from animals like cattle, sheep, or ducks, was a rare luxury reserved for the wealthy or for religious festivals. For most people, the taste of roasted meat might come only a few times a year. Cooking was done over small clay stoves or open fires. Pots of stews simmered slowly, filling homes with the scent of lentils and herbs. Spices were scarce and precious, so flavor came from what was available: salt, coriander, dill, or cumin. Oil, often pressed from flax or sesame, was used sparingly. The food was humble, but it filled the body with warmth and strength. Meals were eaten by hand, seated on the floor, families sharing from the same pot. There was no ceremony, no formality, just the quiet gratitude that came from having enough to eat in a land where famine was never far away. Hunger was a familiar shadow in Egypt. When the Nile's floods failed, crops withered, and grain stores emptied quickly. Famine and suffering that touched every class. People traded possessions for food, ate roots or insects, and sometimes starved beside the river that had once fed them. The gods were blamed, and prayers filled the air as people begged for the return of the water's bounty. Even in good years, food was rationed carefully, for everyone knew that plenty could vanish overnight. You might think of it as scarcity, but to them, it was balance, a constant reminder that life depended on harmony between man, nature, and the gods. Feasts, when they came, were grand by contrast. During festivals or temple ceremonies, the wealthy shared roasted meats, bread sweetened with honey, and jugs of strong beer. The aroma of grilled goose and baked dates filled the air. For the poor, even the leftovers from such celebrations were treasures. These moments of abundance were reminders of how fragile and precious food was. Eating was not just survival. It was a spiritual act, one that connected the people to the gods and to the eternal cycle of life and death. For you, used to endless variety, spices, and freshness, the Egyptian diet would feel monotonous. The bread would scrape your teeth, the beer would taste strange, and the simplicity would wear on you after just a day. Yet for them, Food was a quiet victory over the desert. Each meal, no matter how small, was a triumph of patience and endurance. In the rhythm of kneading dough, stirring stew, and sharing bread, they found comfort, stability, and faith. It wasn't abundance that sustained Egypt. It was resilience. A resilience you'd need to survive, if only for one day, in their world. The first thing you would notice about life in ancient Egypt, beyond the blazing sun and endless sand, was how lightly everyone dressed. The heat was so constant, so all-encompassing, that clothing had to serve one purpose above all else: survival. Linen was the lifeblood of Egyptian fashion, a fabric spun from flax plants that grew along the Nile. Cool, breathable, and pale in color, it reflected the sunlight and allowed air to flow against the skin. But even the best linen could not truly protect you from the heat that ruled over everything. To walk under the sun's gaze in Egypt was to feel your body surrender to it, slowly, minute by minute, until even the lightest garment felt like a burden. Men typically wore a simple kilt or loincloth made of linen, tied around the waist and sometimes pleated for decoration. Laborers often wore little more than that, their skin glistening with sweat as they worked the fields or hauled stones beneath the blazing sky. Women's clothing was often a long, tight-fitting dress held up by shoulder straps, leaving the arms bare to help keep cool. The fabric was thin, and wealthier women might add a sheer outer layer for modesty or elegance. Jewelry was everywhere: bright collars, bangles, and amulets of colored stone or glass. Even the poorest person might own a small charm, shaped like a scarab beetle or an eye of protection, believing it guarded them from harm. In Egypt, adornment was not just beauty, it was belief. But while the upper classes could afford fine linen, perfume, and cosmetics, the ordinary person lived in a haze of dust and sweat. Bathing was important, yet difficult. Without easy access to clean water, washing was done quickly, often in the Nile or with water poured from jars. Soap, as we know, it did not exist. Instead, people used natron and natural salt mixture to cleanse the skin. It worked, but it was harsh and drying. Still, Egyptians were known for their cleanliness. They bathed daily when they could, shaved their bodies to fight lice, and applied oils to keep their skin soft under the relentless sun. For you, even with these efforts, the feeling of dryness, sweat, and sand against your skin would be constant. No amount of washing could make you feel truly clean. Perfume and oils play a vital role in daily life. The smell of sweat and decay was unavoidable in a world without plumbing or deodorant, so people masked it with fragrance. Oils scented with lotus, myrrh, and cinnamon were rubbed into the skin after bathing. Even the poorest might mix crushed herbs into fat to create a crude perfume. For the wealthy, perfumes were treasures stored in alabaster jars, used sparingly and associated with status. Women also wore cones of scented wax on their heads during festivals, slowly melting in the heat and releasing fragrance throughout the evening. You might find the idea strange or uncomfortable, but in Egypt it was a small luxury in a life filled with discomfort. Hair was another matter entirely. The heat and insects made long hair difficult to manage, so both men and women often shaved their heads. Wigs made from human hair or plant fibers were worn instead, protecting the scalp from the sun and serving as a sign of beauty and dignity. For the poor, wigs were rare, but even they tried to keep their hair short and clean. Children often had their heads shaved, except for a single lock or braid, known as the side lock of youth, symbolizing purity. This practice kept lice at bay and made daily life just a little more bearable. Yet despite their efforts, the battle against insects was constant. Lice, fleas, and flies were simply part of existence. Footwear was another luxury that many could not afford. Sandals were made of woven papyrus or leather, but most people walked barefoot. The ground was scorching, the sand sharp, and the streets littered with debris. Calloused feet were a mark of labor and endurance. You, used to shoes and comfort, would find even a short walk painful. The sun would bake the soles of your feet, the dust would grind between your toes, and by the end of the day, they would ache from the heat and stones. The wealthy, of course, lived differently. They had servants to fan them, soft linens to wear, and private basins for bathing. They perfumed their bodies daily and wore cosmetics made of ground minerals to protect their skin and enhance their beauty. Eyes were lined with kohl, not just for fashion, but to shield them from the glare of the sun and ward off infection. Women tinted their lips with red ochre and their cheeks with crushed minerals. For them, appearance was a reflection of harmony and favor from the gods. But even in luxury, the heat spared no one. Comfort was an illusion the desert reminded everyone that it ruled all. You, unaccustomed to such a world, would find the constant battle against sweat, dryness, and dust exhausting. Your skin would burn, your lips would crack, and your hair would feel like straw. Every movement would be accompanied by the cling of fabric and the sting of sand against your skin. Yet the Egyptians, born to this world, accepted it with grace. They found beauty where others would find hardship. Their linen robes flowed like light, their oils glimmered under the sun, and their devotion to cleanliness became an art form of survival. In the end, they taught the world something simple but profound, that even in a land of heat and hardship, dignity could still thrive. One drop of perfume can one clean wash at a time. At first glance, life for women in ancient Egypt might seem surprisingly advanced. Compared to many other ancient civilizations, Egyptian women had rights that were remarkable for their time. They could own property, conduct business, inherit wealth, and even appear in court. Some were priestesses, musicians, or landowners. Queens like Hatshepsut and Nefertiti rose to power and left their marks on history. But beneath those exceptions lay a harder truth. For most women, life was one of labor, duty, and quiet endurance. Their world was small, their choices limited, and their hardships many. The illusion of equality faded quickly in the face of survival. A woman's day began before the sun had risen. She would rise from her mat, sweep the dusty floor of her mud-brick home, and begin preparing food for her family. Bread had to be baked, beer brewed, and water fetched from the river. These were not simple tasks. They were exhausting routines that consumed much of her day. Grinding grain on stone querns wore grooves into her knees and calluses into her hands. The fine dust filled her lungs, and her back ached from bending over the heavy stones. Still, there was no time to rest. Children needed care, clothes had to be washed, and animals fed. Every part of the household depended on her steady rhythm of work. Marriage was not romantic. It was practical. Most women married young, often by their mid-teens, and their main role was to bear children and maintain the household. A good wife was one who was fertile, loyal, and industrious. Divorce was possible, and women could even initiate it, but the social pressure to remain married was immense. A divorced woman risked poverty and isolation. The home was her domain, but it was also her cage. Her days passed in an endless cycle of cooking, cleaning, and caring, her life measured in the rise and fall of the Nile and the births of her children. Motherhood was both blessing and burden. Childbirth was dangerous. Many women could not survive it. Without modern medicine, even a minor complication could turn fatal. Midwives used herbal remedies, prayers, and charms to ease pain, but infection and bleeding were constant threats. Infants were washed in the Nile, their skin rubbed with oils to protect them from insects and heat. Mothers carried them everywhere, strapped to their backs while they worked. The sound of babies crying was as common as the hum of flies in the air. Losing a child was heartbreakingly normal. Disease, hunger, or the simple cruelty of chance claimed many before they reached their first year. Yet women endured, their strength quiet but unshakable. Despite their burdens, women found ways to shape their world. They tended small gardens, grew herbs for medicine, and managed household finances. Markets were filled with women selling bread, fish, and pottery, their voices rising above the crowd in the morning heat. Some women became weavers, midwives, or musicians in temples. Others served as priestesses, honored for their devotion to the gods. Wealthier women oversaw estates, directed servants, and wore fine linen dresses adorned with jewelry. They used perfumes and cosmetics daily, believing that beauty was both a reflection of divine favor and a form of protection. Kohl lined their eyes, ochre colored their lips, and oils kept their skin soft against the desert dryness. Even in hardship, they sought dignity. But the truth remained most: women lived invisible lives. Their names were rarely written, their faces never carved into stone. They worked beside their husbands in the fields, carried water under the burning sun, and cared for the sick and elderly without rest. Their labor kept Egypt alive, yet history remembered only the kings and gods. A woman's worth was tied to her role within her family, and once she could no longer bear children or work, she often faded into the background of daily life. There was love, laughter, and community among them, but also quiet resignation. Their world left little room for rebellion. You might think that the rights Egyptian women had would make their lives easier, but freedom meant little when bound by constant necessity. Their endurance was not born of choice, it was survival. The heat, the work, the danger of childbirth, the weight of expectation, all of it pressed down on them every day. Yet they found strength in small joys: the laughter of their children, the comfort of the Nile breeze at dusk, the simple act of preparing food for those they loved. Their resilience was not loud or celebrated. It was quiet and eternal, carved not in stone, but in the flow of time itself. For you, stepping into their world would be overwhelming. The demands would leave you breathless before midday, and the lack of rest would drain your spirit. But for them, it was life. They carried Egypt on their backs and in their arms, their silent work as vital as the Nile that sustained it. They were the unseen force behind the temples, the harvests, and the very survival of the kingdom. Without them, Egypt's greatness would never have been possible, and yet they lived and died in the shadows, their strength written not in hieroglyphs, but in the lives they gave and the worlds they held together. In ancient Egypt, justice was not merely law, it was divine order. The Egyptians believed that the universe itself depended on Mat, the goddess of truth, balance, and justice. Every act of wrongdoing, from theft to deceit, threatened that sacred balance. Maintaining order was a duty owed not only to the pharaoh and the people, but to the gods themselves. This belief made justice a sacred task and punishment an act of restoration. But mercy was rare. The system was built to remind everyone that order was fragile and disobedience would not go unpunished. For someone like you, used to fairness and process, Egypt's system of justice would feel harsh, absolute, and terrifying. There were no lawyers, no formal courts as we know them today. Instead, disputes were heard by local councils of elders, temple priests, or officials appointed by the state. The accused and the accuser both swore oaths before the gods, often invoking the wrath of divine punishment if they lied. Truth, in their eyes, was a matter of faith as much as fact. False testimony was not simply dishonesty, it was a sin against Mat herself, and those who broke that oath risked curses, disease, or death. Every trial was a mixture of legal process and spiritual ceremony, each decision a reflection of cosmic balance. Punishments varied depending on the crime, but they were designed to deter, humiliate, and restore order. Theft, one of the most common offenses, could result in severe beatings, mutilation, or forced labor. For minor thefts, a thief might be flogged with a rod in front of the community, the blows leaving welts and scars that marked them for life. Repeat offenders faced harsher fates, the loss of an ear, a hand, or an eye. In more serious cases, execution was swift and public. The Egyptians believed that the suffering of one could prevent chaos from spreading among the many. Blasphemy, treason, or crimes against the temples were considered the most dangerous of all. To steal from a shrine, desecrate a tomb, or insult the gods was to disrupt the harmony of Maat itself. Such crimes brought terrible punishments: impalement, burning, or death by drowning in the Nile. Tomb robbers, who disturbed the resting places of the dead, faced the worst fate. Their hands might be cut off, their families shamed, and their names erased from records. To have one's name destroyed was not merely dishonor, it was the loss of the afterlife. The eternal death feared more than any pain. Corporal punishment was common even for lesser offenses. Beatings were a tool of control, used by masters against servants, soldiers against workers, and officials against anyone who disobeyed. The whips were made of leather or weeds, and the sound of their crack carried through villages and work sites alike. There were prisons, but they were not meant for long-term confinement. Most were holding places for those awaiting judgment or punishment. Chains, forced labor, and public humiliation were more practical and far more common. Justice was meant to be seen, felt, and remembered. For the wealthy, the system offered more leniency. A noble or priest could appeal directly to higher officials, or even the pharaoh. They might pay fines instead of suffering physical punishment, or offer goods to the temple as penance. But for the poor, there was no such mercy. A farmer who stole grain out of hunger faced the same law as a thief who robbed for greed. The system cared little for reason, it cared only for balance. Even accidents were judged harshly. If your negligence caused harm, you might face lashes or worse, regardless of intent. Responsibility in Egypt was a weight carried by all, with no room for excuses. Public confession was another form of justice. The guilty were often made to admit their crimes aloud, surrounded by their peers, heads bowed in shame. The Egyptians believed that speaking the truth cleansed the soul, but the cost was humiliation. In temples, inscriptions of the negative confession, 42 statements denying sins, were recited by those seeking forgiveness in life or judgment in death. Even in eternity, one was held accountable for every lie, theft, or cruelty. The gods themselves were the final judges. For you, standing in this world of sacred law and divine punishment, the sense of fear would be overwhelming. There was no appeal, no mercy beyond what the gods might grant. A single mistake, a careless word, a stolen loaf of bread, a misunderstood act could lead to suffering beyond comprehension. The people of Egypt lived carefully, guided by a sense of morality that was both noble and oppressive. They believed that justice was not just human but eternal, that every act was seen by the gods and weighed against the feather of Maat. And so they lived with both reverence and fear, walking a narrow path between order and chaos. To break the law was to threaten the very fabric of creation. You, used to freedom and fairness, might call it cruelty, but to them it was harmony, a painful, necessary order that kept the world from falling back into darkness. In Egypt, justice was not blind. It saw everything, and it remembered. Behind the majesty of Egypt's temples, the splendor of its pharaohs, and the perfection of its monuments, there stood an invisible force, its slaves and servants. They were the ones who built, carried, cleaned, harvested, and endured. Without them, the grand image of Egypt would have crumbled like sand. Though slavery in Egypt differed from the brutal systems that came centuries later, it was still a life of hardship, labor, and submission. For many, freedom was a dream they would never see fulfilled. If you found yourself among them, the weight of that existence would crush you long before the first sunset. Slavery in ancient Egypt took many forms. Some slaves were prisoners of war, captured from Nubia, Libya, or Asia, brought back as spoils of conquest. Others were criminals sentenced to servitude as punishment. Many, however, were Egyptians themselves, people who had fallen into debt, sold themselves or their children into bondage, or were born into households where their parents already served. Not all were treated cruelly, but none were truly free. Their lives were owned, their bodies bound to the will of others, their time measured not by their desires, but by commands. A day in the life of a slave began before dawn. They rose quietly, often before their masters stirred, and began their work immediately. In wealthy households, servants swept the floors, prepared bread and beer, fetched water, and tended to children. Their movements were silent, practiced, and constant. Every mistake risked punishment, sometimes a harsh word, other times a beating. They slept on mats in corners or small side rooms, eating leftovers or food prepared separately. Their existence was one of obedience, marked by exhaustion and invisibility. Even kindness from a master came with caution, for it could vanish as quickly as it appeared. For those assigned to physical labor, the life was even more brutal. Slaves and lower laborers worked in quarries, mines, and construction sites, hauling stones, mixing mortar, and carving blocks under the relentless sun. The air was filled with dust, their hands blistered, and their bodies burned from the heat. Overseers carried sticks and whips, ensuring that no one slowed or rested without permission. To them, the laborers were not people, but tools to be used. Some were chained together to prevent escape. Others bore scars from countless lashings. Their voices rarely rose in protest, only in song, low and rhythmic, to keep their spirits from breaking entirely. Not all servitude was physical. Some slaves worked as scribes, assistants, or craftsmen, using skills that granted them a slightly better life. Those who served in temples or royal estates might earn respect, even trust, but they were still bound to their master's commands. A skilled servant could rise to a position of importance, managing others or handling trade, but their status was fragile. One wrong step, one accusation, and all could be taken away. The illusion of security was as thin as the linen they wore. Children born into servitude often knew no other life. From an early age, they were taught to obey, to work, and to endure. Some were raised alongside their master's children, yet the difference between them was unspoken but absolute. The line between freedom and bondage was drawn not by ability, but by birth. Even in death, that line remained. A free person's tomb might hold offerings and inscriptions, while a servant's grave was simple and unmarked. Their names faded with time, their stories swallowed by the sand. Despite it all, humanity persisted. Within the quiet spaces between tasks, slaves and servants formed bonds of friendship, shared food, and whispered songs. They laughed when they could, cared for one another when sick, and found small moments of peace. Some masters, aware of their dependence, treated loyal servants with genuine affection, granting them better food, clothing, or even freedom after years of service. Manumission, the release from servitude, was rare but possible. A freed servant might continue to work for their master out of loyalty or survival, but at least they could claim their life as their own, if only in name. For you, stepping into this world would be unbearable. The endless labor, the lack of rest, the silence of submission, it would strip away your spirit piece by piece. The heat would weigh on you, the overseer's gaze would burn through your pride, and the absence of freedom would feel suffocating. You would learn quickly that in ancient Egypt, strength was not measured by will, but by endurance. Slaves and servants were not powerless because they lacked courage. They were strong because they survived in a world that never saw their suffering as tragedy. Yet in a strange way, the Egyptians saw servitude as part of the natural order. Just as the Nile flowed and the sun rose, so too did people serve and obey. It was how the gods had arranged the world, every person with their place, every life supporting the next. It was the way of Mat, the balance that kept chaos at bay. But beneath that balance was pain, quiet and unending. For those bound in service, hope was not rebellion, it was endurance. the simple act of living one more day under the same burning sun. At first glance, the lives of the Egyptian elite seemed like paradise compared to the toil of the farmers and servants. Their homes were large and cool, their tables filled with fine food, their linen soft and spotless. They wore jewelry of gold and lapis lazuli, their skin perfumed and their bellies full. They lived surrounded by servants who catered to their every need. To the outside eye, they were the blessed few, the ones who lived as close to the gods as mortals could. But behind that, comfort and wealth lay a different kind of burden. Power in ancient Egypt came with pressure, fear, and responsibility that few could truly escape. The upper class consisted of nobles, priests, officials, and scribes, those who worked directly for the pharaoh or the temples. Their lives revolved around administration, religion, and governance. Nobles oversaw large estates, collected taxes, and ensured that the land produced enough to feed the kingdom. Scribes recorded everything: harvest totals, laborers' rations, temple offerings, and even the words of the pharaoh himself. Priests carried out rituals, cared for the gods' statues, and maintained the temples that were the heart of every city. Their days were filled not with sweat and soil, but with rules, ritual, and endless expectations. For them, failure was not just personal, it was cosmic. To neglect their duties was to disrupt Mat, the divine order of the world. A noble's home reflected his status. It stood apart from the crowded villages, surrounded by gardens and pools designed to cool the air. The walls were painted with bright scenes of birds, flowers, and servants carrying food. Inside, furniture was crafted from fine wood, adorned with ivory and gold. The floors were swept daily, the air filled with the scent of incense. Women of the household wore flowing linen robes, their eyes outlined in black kohl, their fingers glittering with rings. Meals were lavish, with roasted duck, figs, honey cakes, and wine imported from distant lands. Musicians played harps and flutes as the elite dined beneath the glow of oil lamps. It was a life of luxury that seemed eternal. Yet, even in this wealth, peace was rare. The nobles were constantly aware of their dependence on the pharaoh's favor. A single mistake, a failed harvest, or a whispered accusation could end everything. Power was a fragile illusion, and loyalty to the throne was absolute. Many spent their lives walking a narrow path between privilege and ruin. The same servants who bowed before them by day could carry rumors by night. Trust was scarce, and ambition was dangerous. For the elite, every gesture, every word, every act was measured. For in a kingdom where the ruler was divine, even a shadow of disobedience was treason. The priests bore a different weight. As keepers of the god's will, they were responsible for maintaining harmony between the mortal and divine worlds. Each morning, they washed and dressed the statues of gods, offered food and incense, and recited prayers to keep chaos away. Their lives might seem filled with peace, but they lived in constant fear of offending the divine. A missed ritual or a flawed offering could bring drought or disease. They, too, were slaves in their own way, not to masters of flesh, but to unseen powers that demanded endless devotion. The temple was their world, and every sound of the gong or the rustle of linen reminded them of their sacred burden. For scribes and administrators, the pressure came from precision. Egypt was a land ruled by record. Every transaction, every grain of wheat, every life had to be accounted for. Mistakes could mean punishment or disgrace. Yet being a scribe was one of the few ways a person of humble birth could rise in society. To learn to write was to hold the power of eternity, for writing preserved names, prayers, and deeds long after death. The scribe's hand gave immortality, but it also carried immense pressure. To miswrite a spell, a tax order, or a decree could bring chaos or death. You would find the work suffocating. Every stroke of the reed pen a test of both memory and skill. Even leisure carried rules. The elite were expected to host banquets, attend religious festivals, and present themselves as examples of mat balance and order in all things. Women of status were admired for beauty and grace, but they lived in gilded isolation, their lives dictated by social expectation and appearance. Children were raised not for happiness, but for legacy. Sons trained to manage estates or serve in temples. Daughters prepared for marriage alliances that strengthened family ties. Love was often secondary to duty. For you, stepping into this world might feel at first like privilege. The cool gardens, the soft fabrics, the endless food all would dazzle your senses. But soon, the weight of expectation would close in. You would realize that every comfort was balanced by fear of losing status, of angering the pharaoh, of offending the gods. Even in luxury, there was no freedom. The servants' whispers would remind you that everyone watched, that your every move could seal your fate. In the end, the life of Egypt's elite was not one of leisure, but of tension wrapped in silk. They were trapped in golden cages, their days filled with duty, their nights with worry. The farmers toiled under the sun, but the nobles toiled under the shadow of power. You might last longer here than in the fields, but peace would never come easily. Even the richest in Egypt lived not to please themselves, but to serve the great machine of order that ruled them all, one heartbeat away from chaos, one misstep away from the wrath of both king and gods. In ancient Egypt, death was not the end, it was a passage, a journey as real and important as life itself. The Egyptians lived with death beside them every day, not as a shadow to be feared, but as a destination to be prepared for. Every prayer, every offering, every moment of devotion was meant to ensure a safe passage into the afterlife. To them, life was fleeting, but eternity was forever. The world of the living was only a chapter, and the afterlife was the story that truly mattered. But preparing for it was an enormous task, one that consumed time, wealth, and hope. To live in Egypt was to live in service to both life and death, always aware that the line between them was as thin as a breath. The Egyptians believed that when a person died, their spirit began a perilous journey through the underworld. It was a realm of trials, monsters, and divine judgment. To survive it, one needed more than courage. One needed preparation. The body had to be preserved, the proper spells recited, and the heart kept pure. Without these, the soul could become lost, trapped, or devoured by the terrible Ammit, the devourer of the dead. Death was not simply dying. It was navigating a divine test, a passage that determined your eternal fate. For most people, burial was simple. The poor were wrapped in linen or mats and placed in shallow graves near the desert's edge, where the dry air naturally preserved their bodies. Even in these humble burials, families placed small offerings, bread or amulets, to protect the spirit. But for the wealthy and powerful, the process was elaborate and sacred. Mummification was the ultimate preparation for eternity. It began the moment death arrived. The body was washed, the organs carefully removed, and each part preserved with care. The heart, believed to hold the soul's essence, was left inside, for it would be weighed in judgment. The brain, considered useless, was removed through the nose with hooked tools, a process that would make your modern mind recoil. The body was then covered in natron salt, left to dry for weeks under the hot air until all moisture was gone. It was then anointed with oils and resins, wrapped in hundreds of layers of linen, and adorned with charms and protective amulets. Each wrapping was done with prayer, each fold meant to guard against the dangers of the afterlife. The face was covered with a mask often gilded or painted to help the soul recognize itself in the realm of the dead. For the poor, such care was rare, but even a single piece of cloth or a spoken prayer was believed to carry meaning. Funeral rites were filled with ritual and emotion. The family mourned loudly, their cries echoing through the air as the procession moved toward the tomb. Musicians played slow, haunting melodies, and priests recited passages from the Book of the Dead collections of spells meant to guide the deceased through the underworld. The tomb itself was a home for eternity, decorated with paintings of daily life, food, and offerings. The idea was simple yet profound. If the afterlife was a continuation of life, then one must bring everything needed to live well. Servant statues, tools, clothing, and food were buried alongside the dead. To be forgotten was to die twice, so the tombs also bore names and prayers to ensure remembrance. The most important moment of all came before Osiris, the god of the dead. In the hall of judgment, the heart of the deceased was weighed against the feather of Mati, the symbol of truth and balance. If the heart was lighter than the feather, the soul was declared pure and allowed to enter the field of reeds, a paradise where crops grew endlessly, where loved ones reunited, and where the pains of earthly life were no more. But if the heart was heavy with sin, it was devoured by Amit, and the soul was condemned to oblivion. There was no hell, no eternal torment, only the terror of being erased from existence. You, standing in this world, would feel both awe and unease. The Egyptians treated death with reverence, but also with an intensity that would overwhelm you. Every life was a preparation for that final test. They spoke to their dead, left offerings long after burial, and believed that the spirits of ancestors watched over them. The living and the dead were not separate. They were parts of the same cycle. Even the grandest monuments, the pyramids and temples, were not built for life, but for eternity. Every stone, every symbol, every prayer was meant to bridge the mortal world and the divine. For the Egyptians, death was not to be feared, but to be respected and mastered. They believed that if they lived rightly upholding Mat, honoring the gods, and fulfilling their duties, they could earn an eternity of peace. It was a belief that gave meaning to their suffering and strength to their labor. But for you, in a world where death is final and unseen, this obsession would feel both strange and beautiful. You might not last long in their daily struggles, but in their understanding of death, you would find something timeless, a quiet dignity born from the belief that no life, no matter how brief or harsh, was ever truly lost. When you step back and look at the story of ancient Egypt, the farmers, the builders, the priests, the mothers, the slaves, and the nobles, you begin to see a civilization that survived not because of ease, but because of endurance. The people who lived along the Nile were shaped by hardship, yet they found beauty and meaning in every part of it. Their world was harsh and demanding, their lives filled with toil and danger, but through that struggle, they built something eternal. The pyramids still rise from the sands, their art still speaks across millennia, and their wisdom still echoes in the modern world. To understand their strength is to understand what it means to persist when everything around you tries to break you. The Egyptians accepted the world as it was a place of order and chaos, light and shadow. They believed that balance, Mat, was the key to existence. Every act of kindness, every word of truth, every offering made to the gods was an attempt to maintain that balance. In a land where the river could bless or destroy, where the sun gave life but also suffering, they learned humility. They didn't fight against the forces of nature, they lived within them. That patience, that quiet endurance, was their greatest strength. They did not ask the world to be kind. They simply adapted and kept going. It is easy today to romanticize Egypt as a land of gold, mystery, and splendor. The temples and tombs stand as proof of their greatness. But behind every monument were thousands of ordinary people who lived unseen and uncelebrated. They were the backbone of history, their sweat mixed with the sand beneath the stones. Their names may not be remembered, but their spirit remains in everything they built. To imagine their daily struggle, the endless labor under the sun, the hunger, the sickness, the devotion is to realize how much the human will can endure. They survived because they believed life had meaning beyond suffering. Even in their beliefs about death, there is something profoundly human. They refused to accept that death was the end. They believed the soul deserved peace, that goodness mattered, that what you did in life would echo forever. In a time before science or technology, they found comfort in faith, in ritual, and in the promise of eternity. That belief gave them courage to face a world that was often unforgiving. You might see superstition, but they saw a hope that transcended time. Built from the same hands that carved stone and sowed seed, there is also humility in their greatness. The Egyptians knew that everything, no matter how powerful or beautiful, would eventually fade. The desert itself reminded them of this truth. Empires rise and fall, kings are forgotten, and monuments crumble, but the cycle continues. Still, they built, they prayed, and they endured. That balance between acceptance and persistence is what kept them alive for thousands of years. It's a lesson as old as the Nile and as new as the dawn. If you were to live among them, you would be tested beyond what you know. The heat, the hunger, the endless work, all of it would press down on you. But if you could endure it, even for a short while, you might come to understand a deeper rhythm of life. A rhythm that values community over comfort, faith over fear, and endurance over ease. The Egyptians did not ask for an easy world. They created meaning within a difficult one. And that is why their story still lives. Their art, their writing, and their monuments are not just remnants of a vanished time. They are messages. Each carving, each symbol of Maat, each offering left for the dead, is a whisper through the centuries. Life is fragile, but purpose gives it strength. The Egyptians knew that even the briefest life, lived with devotion and balance, could touch eternity. They remind us that survival is not only about strength of body, but also of spirit. You might not last a day in their world, but you can still learn from them. You can learn patience from their farmers, courage from their workers, resilience from their mothers, and wisdom from their priests. You can learn that meaning does not come from comfort, but from enduring what life gives and finding grace in it. Their strength was quiet, but absolute, a steady pulse that carried them through centuries of change. And perhaps that is why, even now, long after their empire turned to dust, their spirit still endures, flowing like the Nile itself, eternal, steady, and unbroken. You have now walked through the sands of ancient Egypt, from the blazing sun that scorched every life beneath it to the quiet tombs where eternity was believed to begin. You felt the exhaustion of the farmer, the ache of the builder, the faith of the priest, and the endurance of the mother. You've seen a world that thrived against all odds, a civilization that built greatness from dust and heat, from hardship and devotion. Life in ancient Egypt was not gentle, nor was it easy. Yet the people who lived there carried themselves with a grace that has outlasted time itself. They believed that life, no matter how short or difficult, was part of something greater, and that to live with purpose was to live forever. It's easy now, thousands of years later, to look at the monuments and see only the glory, the gold, the stone, the beauty carved into every wall. But behind every statue and every inscription was a heartbeat. The hands that built them were blistered, the eyes that painted them strained in the dim light, and the hearts that dreamed them into existence beat for survival. Their strength came from unity, from a shared belief that even suffering could serve a purpose. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson Egypt offers us today, that even when life is harsh, we can still build something beautiful. As the night deepens and you rest your thoughts, let your mind drift back to the quiet edge of the Nile. Hear the slow hum of insects, the soft ripple of water under the moonlight, and the faint sound of voices singing ancient songs to unseen gods. Imagine the stars above, the same ones that watched over the pharaohs and the workers, shining across millennia, unchanged. In that vast stillness, there is peace. A peace the Egyptians knew well, the peace of endurance, of belonging to something eternal. If you've enjoyed this journey through time, remember to subscribe to History for Sleep where stories of the past are told to help you drift into calm and wonder. Leave a comment below and share what time in history you'd like to explore next. And tell us when you listen, whether it's at midnight, during a restless hour, or as the first light of morning touches your room. Your curiosity keeps these stories alive. Now, as the echoes of ancient Egypt fade into the desert night, take a deep breath and let your mind rest. The sands are still, the river flows gently, and the voices of history whisper softly through the air. Sleep well, dream deeply, and remember, you wouldn't last a day in ancient Egypt. But for tonight, you've lived 1,000 years in their world.